Interested in more cinema of meaning? Each month we have an entire bonus episode available exclusively on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. So far we've talked about Sam Mendes' 1917, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. In addition to those and any future bonus exclusive episodes, you'll also get access to our regular episodes ad-free and a week early when you listen on Nebula. The best way to get Nebula is with the Curiosity Stream bundle. You can learn more about that in the description below or go to curiositystream.com/cinema of meaning. You can even plug the Nebula feed into a normal podcast player and listen wherever you like. Sign up today to get more cinema of meaning and access to all the other great content on Nebula.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about M. Night Shyamalan's Signs. Thomas, had you seen Signs before?
No, I hadn't. This was actually my first time watching it, and it was one that you brought up last week when we were discussing Nope, and I have to say, I definitely see the kind of parallels that you identified. Feels like almost a spiritual kind of cousin of Nope, granted one from 20 years ago by, in some ways, a very different director. There's a lot of interesting similar themes that it explores, but it also goes in its own unique directions and deals with some things that I think Nope doesn't. So this will be a very interesting film to discuss on the tail of our Nope discussion, which I think we can probably keep Nope spoilers out of this film. We'll definitely
I think so too.
Let you know ahead of time if we accidentally stumble into any. We'll go back and make sure that people are warned. That said, if you've seen Nope and you've listened to our other episode about Nope, there's probably a lot of that discussion that I'm assuming will play a role in this or inform this discussion. So yeah, I enjoyed watching it the first time. You had obviously seen before, so
yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Besides maybe the connection to Nope that we've already talked about, were there other reasons that you were interested in discussing this specifically?
Yeah, because I think even ignoring Nope altogether, I think it shares a lot of the premise and some of the contextual elements, but I think thematically it goes in very different directions that are just interesting in their own right. I think it's a fascinating movie about the meaning of faith, about how we deal with the unknown and the fear of something like some sort of cataclysm that happens, while at the same time we don't understand how exactly it's happening. And I think it's just a really well constructed alien invasion movie. It's an interesting study on perspective, on setup and payoff. I knew at the time, and still I think the movie is getting a lot of criticism for the way it handles its ending and certain elements that are supposedly like plot holes or just bad writing, and I completely disagree with that. I think it's my favorite M. Night Shyamalan movie. I think most people would go to The Sixth Sense as his big movie for which he will be remembered, and that's probably true, but I still like Signs a bit better. I think it's more fun to rewatch it. It has a surprising amount of humor as it as well that I really enjoy every time. I love the performances, I love the setting, I love the music, and I think it's just a really good script that is really efficient at the way it conveys information and then withholds it and then releases it at the exact right times. And it gets a little cheesy maybe towards the end, but I think there's a thematic relevance there that makes it okay, in my opinion. And I think it's also an interesting movie that demonstrates the importance of bringing your own imagination into a story. As I said, the earlier mentioned plot holes, a lot of them, to me at least, they can be resolved by just putting yourself in the perspective of the characters who have limited information and then filling in some of the blanks with your own imagination. And there's an interesting discussion there about what a plot hole is and what an audience or what you as the audience are supposed to know in order to make sense of a story or to enjoy a story or to get some meaning out of it.
Yeah.
That's a lot of the stuff that I look forward to getting into.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a good discussion. I'd be interested to hear about some of what those alleged plot holes are, because I just watched it and haven't read anything about it yet. There wasn't anything that at first glance bothered me in that sense. So that'll be interesting to maybe discuss. I agree with that. I like it. My first impression was that it does rank pretty high, at least in terms of what I've seen from M. Night. I think there is a little bit of like maybe a sentimentality that kind of like almost borders on a corniness by the end, but that's a kind of what I come to expect from M. Night to a certain degree. So like, you know, I don't know. I was expecting that going in. And then B, I think it kind of works in this case. Like, I don't know. It just like fits within the general frame of the movie. And so
I think it works because there's a certain sincerity to it. It reminds me of the Wachowskis and the way they handle not just the Matrix, but you see it in movies like Speed Racer as well. They get like hyper sincere at the end, and some people find it off-putting sometimes, or they do like too sentimental. But I think in the context of this story, it kind of works because the main character is also this super sincere person who lacks any kind of irony. And so, I guess in that sense, it worked for me, or it didn't bother me at least.
I do also, to go back to something that you mentioned, I do really like its use of perspective and the framing of all the information that we get is only what the characters in the story get. And I was thinking about like the impulse, a lot of similar movies I think would probably give into the impulse of like, I guess this is getting into spoiler territory. So if you haven't seen Signs, then slight spoilers, but there's aliens. This is not a huge spoiler yet, but when the lights show up, you only get information through like what's on the TV, and there's not like these huge sweeping shots of like all the different places where, you know, the aliens are showing up. And like, I'm pretty sure, unless I'm misremembering and I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure like even at the beginning when the crop circles first appear, you only see the crop circles. Besides the ones on the farm, you only see the others like through the perspective of what they see on television.
Yeah. There's one, like, as the first time they discovered the crop fields, their own, or the signs in their own crop fields, there's one, like a helicopter shot that kind of pulls out and reveals the whole thing. But that's, I think, the only direct omniscient perspective that you get in the movie. But after that, I think it's all of them is just what's shown on television or recorded by other characters in the world, supposedly. And
and I really like that isolation and that reservation of like staying with the characters and in this place. To me, that just like gives a movie a sense of presence that really works for this kind of story. Like, I wouldn't say it's never appropriate to, you know, go into that omniscient mode. It just depends on the kind of story that you're telling. And in this case, it's like a family, and it's much more about that family's grief and their, you know, them dealing with faith and these specific situation. And so I think it gives the movie a lot more immediacy and presence to keep it like always within their frame. And so that was one of my favorite things, just about how things are presented and how the story is framed.
This episode was brought to you by Mubi, the curated streaming service showing hand-picked exceptional films from around the globe, which both Thomas and I have been big fans of for many years. They have a fantastic library of amazing films, and they add a new one every day. Whether it's a timeless classic, a cult favorite, or an acclaimed masterpiece, there's always something new to discover. And if you go to mubi.com/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes, you can try Mubi yourself for free for 30 days. So be sure to claim that extended free trial and start your month of great cinema today. Should we start with a basic plot outline and kind of see from there like what the actual story behind it is? Because there's obviously the superficial layer of it is that there's a family in this small community. They have a small farm, or at least a house outside of town where in their own crop fields they find ominous sign, like some extraterrestrial. Or at first they think it's a prank or something, but there's something that spooks them. And then as the time goes by, like it's slowly revealed that there's something going on a like global level. There's an alien invasion that slowly but surely they're revealing like, this is real. This is happening. We have to take measures. We have to do something. But I think also at the same time, the family is dealing with this personal tragedy. The main character, Graham, played by Mel Gibson, he was a reverend whose wife passed away in a accident, after which he kind of lost his faith. That's pretty much, I think, the more personal story that's set up there. His brother came to live with, or he moved in after to support his family. He's played by Joaquin Phoenix in a really great role, in my opinion. And those two layers, they kind of become intertwined with each other as the alien invasion for a lot of people, including the family. It starts to invoke questions about the existence of God and maybe the coming apocalypse, and just the question of what does all this mean? Is there a purpose to all this? Is it all just random chance? And yeah, I think that to me is the kind of main question that's posed here.
Yeah.
But I like that it's presented with a certain lightheartedness, at least at first.
Right.
There's a lot of humor in the way they think it's a prank at first, and they kind of treat it as such. So when there's the first actual alien on the roof, they think it's Lionel and the Wolfington brothers or something like that. And you get this really funny scene where Joaquin Phoenix is kind of encouraging Mel Gibson to scream around the house and act like really violently and aggressive, which is really out of character for him. And then the day after, they have to explain it to the police officer, and there's this whole interaction about the possibility of it being a woman and like an Olympic
Scandinavian
high jumper. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of subtle absurdity to it all that, for me, it's just a fun movie to rewatch. And
I do like how funny it was, especially at the beginning. To that note, like one of the things I really appreciate about Shyamalan is the way he moves the camera and frames things is particularly strong. Like even in his weaker films, there's usually very interesting ways in which he like composes scenes and like the perspective that he uses. And he uses that to humorous effect in this movie in a couple places. Like there's that one scene where Graham goes into the like drugstore or something, and the girl behind the counter is wanting to like confess to him. And he's like, I'm not a reverend anymore. And she's like, yeah, but I'm afraid the world's ending, kind of like, and then like it cuts away and then comes back and she's like giving her like confession about how many times she said douchebag. And as she's saying this, like an old guy, like his head like pokes out from behind Mel Gibson. You realize like he's been there the entire time. It's the kind of thing you would expect in like a Wes Anderson movie or something. But he'll be like fairly dry for the entirety of a scene or something, and then like just poke this like kind of bit of absurdity into the world, which is fun.
There's also that moment where at first you have a scene where the children, they have these aluminum heads, and then a little while later something that happens, and then Graham comes in and he sees his brother too is sitting between the kids with the same head. And the way they're positioned, it's interesting that if you compare it to War of the Worlds, for example, with the Tom Cruise one, I feel that's a movie that for me doesn't work, in large part because it's so heavy-handed. It's also a good example of a movie that doesn't leave anything to the imagination, that kind of immediately hits you, because it's kind of the same setup. It's a small family drama in the context of a larger alien invasion, but that doesn't really refrain from showing you the big destruction and the big aliens and all the major action. It's all happening as the characters are accidentally in the neighborhood of that happening. In that sense, I like Signs a lot more for having so much restraint in the way it really commits to not showing you anything. And it also makes the things that it does show you much more impactful, like the scene with Joaquin Phoenix seeing that first alien on the birthday tape on television, where he's sitting in the closet and there's this news report on a supposed amateur filming of an actual alien, and you see all these kids, and again there's that little funny moment where Joaquin is like move children, vomit.
yeah.
But then when the actual alien steps out, it's like this kind of Bigfoot shot. When I saw this movie for the first time when I was still like a young teenager, like that was one of the most genuinely suspenseful scenes that I'd ever seen at that point. And it so effectively shows what you can do when you hold back and then build that anticipation and then release even just a little bit can be so impactful, so effective. And that's something that I really love about this movie. Even from the opening scene, there's also so much conveyed within just a few shots. I think one of the first shots is a picture of Graham with his wife, and then you see him wake up apparently from a nightmare, and he's alone in the bed, and the next shot I think is him stepping out of the shower or stepping out of the bathroom, and you see on the wall there's this little white cross on the wall where an actual cross used to be
Right.
or used to hang, and so you can see it's been taken down. Like, and there's just 2 shots, and you have already established, like, okay, he had a wife, but not anymore. Something's happened. He used to be religious, but also not anymore because something happened. And then the next shot, I think, is he steps out of the bathroom because his daughter is screaming, and then the brother also hears it in the he's living in the barn or something, like some sort of outside house.
An apartment above the garage outside, yeah.
Yeah, and so that immediately establishes that relation, and that's like barely a minute into the movie.
Yeah.
So that's something I really love about this one. It's so there's not a wasted scene or shot there. Even when you look at there's that scene where the dog attacks the children, and what's the name of the kid again? Morgan. He stabs the dog with like a barbecue fork thing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you would call it.
I don't know what you would call that actually, but yeah, it's like a grill tongs, or not a tongs, but like a skewer thing.
But even that is like set up just a few scenes earlier, where Morgan is taking over the barbecue because he's worried that Dad's gonna burn the pieces of meat again, and then you see like the Chekhov's barbecue fork.
Yeah.
It's just such a masterclass in establishing information and then having like these little setups that pay off later. And one thing I also noticed this time around is there's obviously the big reveal at the end where the alien is vulnerable to water, and of course the little girl Bo, she has all these glasses of water standing around
everywhere. Yeah.
And there's a scene very early on in the movie where you see Graham is like making an attempt to clean them up, but then he sees there are so many of them that he just doesn't he just doesn't bother with it altogether. So there's even that little setup for why there are so many glasses, and it's just because he's too lazy to pick them up. I think that's when the police officer came around. So he was also like, he didn't have all the time in the world to clean the house. And I don't know, I don't have a bigger point with this, except for that it's just such a well-written script in the sense of using screen time and shots and information effectively. And yeah, I think that's always something that's worth mentioning.
It's definitely worth mentioning because I feel that missing from so many films or from a lot of TV that I watch these days is just like a very basic fundamental grasp of like those methods of suspense and that like sense of setup and payoff. It feels like a lot of it is just left to like stuff that's happening in the plot of like the dialogue, and there's not much attention paid to like, let's set up this visual element, let's set up this element visually on screen while something else is happening, and that's going to pay off later on. Or just like very particular attention paid to the way in which information is revealed. And if you watch this movie and you look at how often you as the viewer want to be seeing something that's happening, but like instead of showing that to you, he's focusing instead on a character's face, or the flashlights are off, or like something else is going on. That kind of move is so important for this kind of film, this kind of movie, and it's missing from a lot of stuff, I think. So it's great to see that present in movies like this, and I very much appreciate directors and creators who lean on that kind of Hitchcockian like sort of stuff. I think he was kind of the original master of that, but more people should take notes.
Oh yeah. What I also noticed this time around, I'm curious to hear your opinion about it, because it's more of a cinematography thing, is that you had a lot of shots where Mel Gibson's character would be framed like right in the like dead center, and it would be like this wide angle shot that kind of makes the whole scene around him not necessarily distorted, but it's a very distinctive shot, and it comes back like a couple of times, and I'm curious to hear if you noticed it or what your thoughts would be on that.
I don't think I noticed the particular motif.
Yeah, because I think it's only his character that has this
like
specific
that.
framing. Yeah, I think it's slightly down angle too. Like the camera is slightly above his eye line. But yeah, I think it's there in the scene that you mentioned with the girl that's confessing to him.
Yes, yes.
Like she is slightly off center, slightly more normal, but he is dead center. And then again at the end when there's the big reveal that there's obviously that big center framing. And
yeah, I do think I know the one actually now that you describe that you're mentioning. I don't off the top of my head have commentary about how that's being used, besides the fact that like I think those kinds of shots, if they're used for example, his character and not the others, it kind of helps focus the story and center him as the protagonist, even though there's a lot of attention also given to the other characters in the family. But I definitely noticed stuff like there's a conversation they have about the aliens, and they say something about like watching us from the sky or something. And then immediately after that, they're driving into town and there's a shot like from the sky looking down at the car. And it's the kind of shot that we wouldn't think twice about now because it's like a typical kind of like drone shot straight down. But this was pre-drones, and it's kind of an unusual sort of helicopter shot for this era of filmmaking. Yeah, I just love little things like that where it's like it just plants that little seed in the back of your mind that like maybe you are getting like a little bit of a perspective shot and it's looking down and it's watching them, and it doesn't really have any specific meaning beyond just like reinforcing those little ideas and you know, pieces.
Yeah, there's a lot of tiny details like that. Some of them don't even seem to matter that much. Like I'm not sure if you noticed, but there's that scene early on where the dog pees on inside the house, and the children are worried that the dog is sick, and so they want to call the animal doctor. But Graham, he wants to call a regular doctor, and then his son is like, well, he doesn't treat animals, and Graham's kind of like, oh, we'll figure it out. And then later it is revealed that the guy who killed his wife, he was actually played by M. Night Shyamalan, is the veterinarian. Yeah, he's the vet.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why earlier in that scene, he didn't want
to call him.
Don't want to contact him. Yeah.
Interesting.
It's just, little things like that all. Everything seems to piece together somehow, which, that's just, to me, that's just fascinating.
And also relevant to kind of the themes of the movie, which are very much about whether or not, by the end, it's very much exploring the ideas of whether or not things have a reason or purpose, or somebody is kind of making sure things happen in a specific way, or if it's just luck and chance and, you know, just kind of coincidence.
Yeah, I think maybe if we can talk about Graham's character arc, that I think is also most closely connected to the more thematic progression of the story.
Yeah.
Because, as we've talked about, he starts off as a reverend who has lost his faith. And there's this big, important monologue that he gives to his brother about there essentially being two types of people, those who believe in random chance and those who believe that everything happens for a reason. So essentially there's the non-religious and the religious point of view. And he adds to it that when in the context of the alien invasion, that whenever the first group looks at it, they see a random chance, like a 50-50, like it could be good, it could be bad, but they know in the end that whatever happens, they're on their own. Whereas the second group, they see those signs, they see those lights in the sky, and they see a miracle. Instead of feeling the fear of being alone, they feel a certain sense of hope because they are assured that they are not alone, that they have someone watching over them. And then he also adds after that conversation that he places himself in the first group. He has lost his faith. He no longer believes there's anyone watching over him, whereas the rest of his family, including his brother, they still believe, or they still belong to that second group.
Yeah.
And so there's a struggle there between him and his family, but also obviously within him internally, like there's an internal struggle for meaning that as the alien invasion progresses, slowly becomes more relevant and more unavoidable. There's one question I had about that. There's something that I still can't really make sense of, is that there's a lot of, even if you assume that everything is connected and all has meaning, as is kind of shown towards the end, there's also like some false signs. When they are looking at the book, they see, for example, this house that resembles their own and it's being shut down by this UFO, and there's this grown man or a grown person with two dead children laying beside it, and they make this like remarked, like, oh, it's kind of like our house. And it seems to be like this, almost like a prediction of what will happen. And then there's also, it's kind of more on the, more an afterthought, but they also mention that Bo has some visions or some sort of dreams that may come true or not.
Yeah.
Like it's, and she dreams at one point that Morgan is going to die, but of course doesn't happen at the end. Neither does the first thing about them being killed by the aliens. So that's something I'm still trying to make sense of. Why are there like misdirections or just false signs in a movie that's supposed to be about meaningful signs?
Right.
You know?
I wondered about that as well. And I guess, I don't know, I haven't watched enough of Shyamalan's like work or listened to him talk about things enough to know what his like personal, perspective is. And this movie, particularly by the end, does seem to sort of affirm a kind of like belief or faith. But then I wonder if that's him just planting these kinds of like seeds of doubt that might, inform the perspective of like, to what extent do we sometimes see what we want to believe instead of, to what extent do we pick to believe in the signs that end up being true instead of looking at everything. We have confirmation bias and those kinds of things. I don't know if he's actually trying to get at that kind of commentary with those moments, or if it's just as simple as like dramatic misdirection of being like false foreshadowing. So we think it's going to end badly, and then the twist is kind of more that it doesn't, and that things turn out, pretty okay. Because for like a what feels like it's going to be a horror movie for a lot of it, or what feels like it's going to be this more, it ends up with nobody dies. The aliens are dispatched pretty easily, at least within the realm of what we see. And so there is this sort of like mounting tension that he kind of dissipates at the end, which I think is an interesting move. But I don't know to what extent he's making a comment with the false signs.
Yeah. I do like the way that he poses the question of religion as one that's not about so much about the existence of God or God making some kind of unmistakable revelatory sign towards humanity that convinces everyone that he exists and that they should believe in him, but that it's more of a question of personal attitude and personal perception. And it kind of seems to embrace that there's parts of the universe or the cosmos or the fabric of reality or whatever you want to call it that we do not understand and that we do not have the knowledge about, and that's maybe reflected, might be reaching here, but maybe reflected by the alien invasion and the nature of us, or at least this family, not understanding what it means and what it is, even because they don't know, like even towards the end, they're kind of in doubt about what the aliens were, what they were doing here, why they left so early, and basically they have no clue as to what just happened. So it's not a matter of collecting evidence and then having this well thought out worldview. It's more like a personal choice to make sense of whatever it is that you can know, while also like acknowledging that you can never have an absolute truth.
Right.
And I once made a video about science, actually, where I argued that it's actually a great movie about the nature of faith. And I think in that movie in that video, I talked about Viktor Frankl, the author, who also talked about the question of ultimate meaning. And he kind of posed it as like, if you have like a sort of snake that represents some sort of form of trajectory or like some meaningful progression or of events, and you take it like a slice out of that and you represent that 3D image into like a 2D image, and then you can only see like the points where it crosses the paper, and it will look like unconnected dots. And he kind of uses that as an metaphor for the way we experience reality, and that there are like higher dimensions, and it might be that we only see like dots, but we cannot see the way they are connected to each other. So when talking about ultimate meaning, it's ultimately like a question of, do we choose to see those signs as maybe connected in some way that we cannot understand, or do we see them as random?
Right.
And that, I think, is basically what Graham argues in the movie, that like, do we choose to see this as a sign, or do we choose to see this as some random event.
Yeah.
But I do, in hindsight, when I rewatched the movie yesterday, that I did have slightly more critical perspective of how it portrays its existential question, because the one thing I'm not sure about now is it feels like there's a confusion between posing the question of the existence of God and then also posing the questions of what that would mean in moral terms, because it's kind of conflated that if God is real, then there's also that automatically means protectiveness and goodness and guardianship for his believers, for humanity. It seems to argue that if God is real, then the alien invasion is fine because God is watching over them and everything will be fine.
Right.
Whereas then it could very well be true that if God is real, then maybe this alien invasion is part of the plan. I think there's been weirder things in the Bible than maybe it is God's plan that we are being grown for aliens to harvest us. And that, to me, that's the only critical point I would have with this movie, at least on a thematic level, that it kind of conflates ultimate meaningfulness or the idea that there is some plan with that there's some kind of ultimate goodness on a personal level, or some kind of guardianship, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think there's kind of maybe a little bit of a messiness to how it's posing that question. I had a little bit of a hard time putting my finger on it at the beginning, because it's kind of, it's showing Graham as someone who he's lost his faith in God, and kind of because of that, he's more skeptical and less likely to have faith in the fact that the aliens even exist and aren't a hoax at the beginning. There's kind of an interesting relationship there, because it's discussing the spectrum of skepticism versus faith, but then it's almost posing the idea of faith as a universal faith in just wanting to believe in things. Meryl Joaquin's character even kind of says that at some point. He says faith in things. He doesn't say faith in God, but faith in things, a willingness. He poses it almost more as a willingness to believe. And that, to me, kind of that's definitely a thing. You can kind of fall on this spectrum of I'm a skeptical person and I have a very high barrier. I need a lot of evidence. My standard of evidence for what I will believe in is very high, versus, people who are more open in general to belief and whatever. That's definitely a spectrum. And so there's an interesting discussion to be had there. And I think the movie kind of touches on it to some extent. But then it doesn't necessarily follow that. Then if you're just oh, I have faith or I'm willing to believe in stuff, that you're well, the aliens, if I come to believe that the aliens are real, that means I also believe that God exists. It kind of weirdly conflates these two things in a way that for a lot of people, I think on some level, in especially with the kind of faith it's dealing with here, there are a lot of Christians who do believe that aliens could be real, or that aliens are real. But in a lot of more traditional Christian circles, a lot of people don't believe that. And so it's almost a weird, I think there's probably a lot of Christians for whom seeing aliens and knowing aliens were real would actually cause them to question their worldview, because there's a very specific Christian metaphysic that's there's God and then there's humans, and that's the whole story. And so seeing something out,
no aliens in that creation,
right? Yeah, the aliens aren't in the Bible, that kind of stuff. And so seeing something outside of that almost had this metaphysical import would almost be more of a face shattering moment than it would be I have faith, so I'm going to be more likely to believe in these aliens. Not that that's the way it is for everybody.
Yeah, because it's true that Graham, I think, is the last one to really be convinced of the presence of the aliens.
Right.
But at the same time, it also becomes a catalyst for him regaining his faith.
Yes.
Because I think from the moment he accepts the aliens, or accepts that the aliens are real, that's, I think, when he wants to go to the lake, but he's outvoted by the family, so they stay at home. And then then it obviously becomes real as the aliens are entering, entering the house, they're breaking down the doors. And then there's one shot that I really love. It's when they hurry into the basement, and then Graham is leaning against the door, and this slow motion shot of his face. I think it's the only of two slow motion shots. There's one later when Morgan is revealed to be alive, but there's that first slow motion shot of his face just leaning against the door, and he says something like, I'm not ready.
Right.
And from there there seems to be some turning point for him. At that point, he starts, I think that's a little later when Morgan gets his asthma attack, and then he kind of starts talking to God again. He's like,
right.
He's still angry. Like one of the first things he says, like, don't do this to me again. I hate you. That sort of stuff. So there is a twist there where once the aliens, like the reality of the aliens becomes inescapable, that's also when his conflict with God becomes inescapable in some way. So yeah, there's an interesting journey there in relation to how he looks at the aliens and what that does to the struggle with his faith.
Yeah, and that's all pretty directly connected to the flashbacks that are revealing more details about the death of his wife, and we get this kind of unraveling of that situation where we, realize that like the circumstances in which she died were extremely like the Ray, the guy played by M. Night, he just like happens to fall asleep and drive off the road and hit her at this one spot. And it's like, what are the chances? What are the odds of that happening?
Yeah. To quote Nope, it was like a bad miracle.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like a bad miracle. Yeah. And Ray even says that when he's kind of, there's this moment where there's a confrontation between them a little bit. He's like, it's like it was meant to happen. And his wife also in one of the flashbacks kind of says a similar thing. And so he's dealing with this, like, from that perspective, we almost see his loss of faith as maybe like a coping mechanism of being like, it's easier for him to believe it's just chance and there's no meaning to all of it than that was meant to happen. And that was a thing that, had meaning and that his wife was supposed to die. And then he kind of, as the aliens are coming, he's starting to like move back on that a little bit and like regain some faith, but he's still angry. And then the final portion of that movement is towards the end. There's this sort of like new miracle of like his son barely escapes death because his asthma attack closes his throat while the alien is trying to like poison him, and then he lives. Like it seems like the movie is suggesting then like he experiences what he sees as like a good miracle, which is like, oh, he was meant to survive, and that is kind of the thing that predicates like his return to faith at the end.
There's also that thing where the final words of his wife finally make sense in the context of that new situation, where it's almost like some kind of premonition, where at first it seems like she's just talking like gibberish as he explains it as like the brain neurons are firing off, and she's talking randomly, and then at the end it's kind of connects together in a way out of that situation. But it's also true, by the way, the alien that is in the house at the end is also the one that Graham cut the fingers off in the pantry, and it said on the radio like the aliens are gone, but only some of the wounded have been left behind. So there's also that thing where it's kind of also Graham's own doing that kept the alien there, but it's all meant to be.
It's all meant to be. It's all meant to be within the world of Shyamalan's imagination. It's definitely an interesting exploration of like the relationship to this idea of miracles or signs. The thing that keeps playing in my mind every time I hear signs, there's a term within like a biblical term, a term within Christianity, like signs and wonders that kind of like go together to refer to miracles. And like within the Bible, there's certain times where like Jesus kind of talks about signs and wonders. There's this relationship to like signs and wonders, miracles happening, and the relationship between miracles and faith. There's an interesting way in which they're treated where sometimes they're almost not looked down upon. That's not quite the right word, but it's like there's this sense that like you shouldn't need miracles in order to believe. There's places where Jesus kind of suggests you people will only believe because of signs and wonders. That's almost like a suggestion that like your faith is weak because you kind of need these miracles to believe.
Yeah, because if you need evidence, then it's no longer a belief, then it's just
right.
And like then it becomes fact.
It's fact, and there's not an element of faith required in like, kind of choosing to have this relationship to it. So I don't know how that plugs into the movie, but it's interesting how it plays with that idea and it's kind of there throughout.
Yeah. I think you can also look at it just from a more pragmatic angle where you see Graham's attitude, not just towards faith and just life in general, but also the way I guess it's just his more like, he becomes more pessimistic. He becomes a bit more like, it affects his mood towards others and just in the moment, where you see when he's giving that big monologue about coincidence versus signs towards his brother was essentially just asking for some reassurance, like just he's like in doubt, he's frightened, probably he's just asking for like give me like some hope. Graham, he kind of ends on the downer, like that he believes we're all alone, and later again it's his brother confronts him, that saw in it like a look in his eyes that Graham didn't think they would survive the night, like after the basement scene, and it's a look he never wants to see again. So there's also this element of just how you perceive like coincidence versus signs is also affects the way you move through the world in a way, the way you compose yourself and the way you present yourself to others and to yourself, and just it kind of decides the kind of energy or the vibe that you carry with you and reflect onto others. And so there, I think there's also, when I mentioned the shot at the door, when he says like, I'm not ready, I feel there's also a turning point in the way he becomes slightly more, like he becomes more of a fighter. He becomes more courageous, I think, also in a way. And so it also does something to just, not just your worldview, but also maybe like other virtues or just your general attitude to how you go about things.
And right after that, there's kind of a change there's a similar situation where the son is having the asthma attack, and he's kind of talking his son through that. And unlike with his brother, he holds this posture of like, it's going to be okay, like, believe you're going to be fine. He kind of has a second monologue there that tilts more in that direction of like, even if you don't know, even if you're not sure, having faith that it's going to work out, it's going to be okay, is like a good thing to have. And that's kind of what he's framing in that moment. That definitely has an effect on people. I was just reading a book called Full Catastrophe Living by John Kabat-Zinn is the author's name. And he talks about some studies in that book that they did around like cancer patients' belief about whether or not they will survive and their relationship to survival rates. And like I'm not making a specific metaphysical claim about like believing something makes it come true. But I think what some of those studies show is that people who have that sort of bearing of like, oh, I think I am going to survive, do actually fare a lot better in a lot of circumstances because, it probably has some, we don't understand it completely, but it probably has some kind of, you're less stressed. So your body is in less of a state of like strain and all these other things. And so maybe you're healthier, and then that allows your body to, who knows, even within a materialistic framework, you can find examples of how your perspective on something, or whether or not you have faith, quote unquote, about an outcome is going to have a bearing on like what happens in that situation, and not just your mood, but like maybe actual outcomes.
Is that also what I think it's called the law of attraction, that kind of proposes something similar, but maybe in a more slightly scammy way, where it's...
You can definitely get into weird territory with those ideas very quickly. So like, I definitely don't want to promote an idea that like, oh, you just believe something and that's going to come true, because I don't think that's the case. But like the complete opposite is also not true, which is that like what we believe about things has no effect on, ourselves or how we feel or whatever. I think what people believe, has a huge impact on their relationship to the world.
To kind of simplify it somewhat, I think the main distinction there is whether you present the causal relation between, let's say, especially in that like the cancer survivor example, like if you like imply that the causal relation is you're optimistic, so ergo like the cancer goes away, that's obviously like that's probably false. or in the same way that you believe, like, I think that good things will happen, or in the context of the movie, like Graham at the end, he's believing, like, and repeating constantly, like Morgan's, his lungs were closed, he didn't inhale the poison, like his lungs were closed, the poison didn't get in. But that, there's no relation between, like, no causal relation between that belief and the actual reality of it. But I guess if you want to make a relation there, it's maybe your mood affects like some third element that in turn informs the other one. Like there's a kind of, like, if you're a nicer person, then you might not directly attract like good opportunities, but it might be that other people are attracted to like your sense of humor or something. Like if your optimism informs something else, which in turn attracts like better things. But to me it's a bit of a messy concept that I don't want to pay like too much, or I don't want to give it too much credit beyond the point that, as you said, like being a completely pessimistic person or someone who kind of withdraws himself from the world also obviously becomes like more of a passive force who doesn't make things happen. I think a good example of that in the movie is the dinner scene. There's one of my favorite moments in the movie, actually, where they have this sort of a last supper and everyone gets what they want, but no one is enjoying it because kind of being like very down about it. And because his son wants to say a prayer, but he won't allow it. He's just doesn't want to hear it. And then he becomes angry and he starts like eating out everyone's food and everyone becomes upset. And there's this small bit of negativity. It kind of snowballs into this, just very, like, one of the more dramatic moments, I think, in the movie, that nevertheless ends with on a more beautiful note where they just embrace each other and kind of find some connection there. But you can definitely say that the way his attitude changes over the course of the movie also affects the way he not only reconnects with his faith, but also reconnects with his family.
Yeah, I think so as well. It's definitely a complicated discussion and it's a messy kind of idea to explore. And I think like the fun kind of tongue-in-cheek things about this is that it is a movie about aliens. So it's dealing with this kind of like more, it also has this absurdist element to it, which, I mean, it's maybe not, but it's like, it's coming at it from like this angle of like this more pop culture angle that wouldn't necessarily always have this like kind of religious or philosophical weight given to it. And kind of,
it's not exactly the Tree of Life or Andrei Rublev or
that does kind of capture that element of how, you know, the relationship between like these ideas and the fact that they can turn into things like the law of attraction, where people are like, oh, you know, if I just like chant this, if I just say something and believe it, like it's going to come true and I'm going to become rich if I just like write that in a book over and over again or something. And it's like the boundary between like, I would say like meaningful faith that has this like deep impact on your life and a very like surface level faith that might provide some level of comfort, but is also like like just the example that Meryl gives, that for why he's a miracle man. He's like, I'm sitting on this couch, I'm about to kiss this like beautiful girl, and then I realize I have gum in my mouth, so I turn to spit it out, and I turn back, and she's throwing up, and he's like, that she could have been throwing up on me, and it's like that's why you know, he's seeing a miracle in that, the absurdity of that moment, which is, I mean, it's great.
Such a unprofound revelation. Maybe also the distinction there is that the more superficial one that you mentioned also tends to be more like one of more transactional, like I believe this, so I'm getting this from the universe. If I put this into the universe, I get this back. Whereas it's kind of like praying for $100 or something, like it's not an actual prayer. You're just saying something you want and appealing to the highest force in order to get it. It doesn't I don't think that even like the most religious people would say that they would say that that's not what religion means. That's not what it means to pray and to have a conversation with God, or however you want to frame it. That's just shenanigans, I guess.
I think like a deeper, more meaningful sense of faith looks something more like the Viktor Frankl idea that you mentioned earlier, which is like it has an understanding of your own inability to see the entire situation. And I think it like grapples with in a real way the possibility, like the impossibility of really knowing. And so that's where it is kind of faith in a sense, because you're looking at the dots and you're saying like, there might be a snake here, but we can't see the snake. You essentially have a choice between being like, well, it's just dots, or maybe there's a snake. And you
For the record, he didn't actually call it a snake, but that was kind of my me paraphrasing.
But within that metaphor, like you kind of make the choice between the two, and that's sort of where faith lies. By the end of this movie, Graham is like, yes, there's a snake.
A cosmic snake of meaning.
Yes. I mean, the interesting thing is, while they do see the aliens, like he goes from skepticism to actually believing in the aliens, but like it's obvious they show up. It's like, oh yeah, there's signs, like we can see the aliens are there. But like his ultimate return to faith is predicated on something that is like, that can't be seen. Like he's choosing to go like, oh, my son didn't die because this happened, and that looks like a miracle to me. But like ultimately, it's not like God descends out of the clouds at the end and like makes a crop circle.
It's basically him just reconnecting dots in his own life and turning them, or like rendering them meaningful.
Yeah.
And I think that's also, if to kind of maybe move into like a concluding part, like where a lot of the plot holes come from, or the supposed plot holes, where people are, I think that's where a lot of people were turned off in that final revelation, where it is revealed that the aliens are vulnerable to water.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people were like, oh, why then didn't they reveal that soon? Like, why did they even come to Earth? That's like 2/3 water.
Right,
or why did they, like, didn't they rain to death somewhere? Or
yeah.
It's basically like people didn't accept the premise of it, aside from like what the scene signified in terms of Graham refinding or rediscovering his faith. But that was it's kind of like that whole discussion. I think back then you had the IMDb message boards where a lot of people were active, and it kind of felt like the pre-Cinema Sins version of film criticism, where you kind of focus in on these not plot holes, but like not totally logical elements of the story. But I always thought it was so silly, because there's even this explanation early on in the movie where there's a lot of people giving their own interpretations of what they think is going on. And one of them is the military officer, who pretty much explains like, oh, this is like a recon mission. They're sending out like a few individuals here and there. They're kind of probing what's going on. And so that's always what I thought, like, oh, maybe these aliens are not even like the main aliens. Maybe they are just like worker slaves, or like lesser versions of the actual aliens. Or maybe it's not the water itself, but something in the water that they didn't anticipate. Or it's just one of those discussions that was so easily explained if you just kind of activate your own imagination, in my opinion, instead of just getting lost in everything that the story or the script does or does not explain properly. And I feel like that's why now we have movies that feel the need to over-explain everything, because they don't want to end up with a cinema sin or an honest trailer that's too harsh on them. Or
there was a very big like 2000 era of like measuring movies by how they fit together in this very kind of like rational sense, which I think is like, you know, plot holes can be annoying, especially if they're glaring and big and relate to like thematic elements of the film, or like it makes the characters' actions not make any sense or whatever. But there can often be like an over focus on that kind of thing, and people want everything to be explained in like super fine grained detail, instead of accepting kind of like the realm of a movie as like, this is a story that you know, that's being told, and it's, you know, it's fictional. Which I think there's a movement back towards that in a little bit, which I like. But yeah, that doesn't bother me too much. I like the conception of like, I like that the aliens were kind of easy to defeat.
It's kind of a War of the Worlds-y also. They also end up being just defeated by some bacteria on Earth,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, or just some element that to us is just too obvious to even think about in
Right.
alien warfare, I guess.
Yeah.
Just give them like a fever and they'll be gone.
They'll be gone.
Yeah.
I think it's fun to be like, well, they are not omniscient and all-knowing. Like they're more advanced than humans, but I don't know. It's funny to me that we have certain things that we have like fictionalized conceptions of, and then people get so uptight about how that thing is represented. Like they're like, I have my one idea of how aliens work, which is that they are, exactly this way, but they're humanoid. They're so insanely, more advanced that they would just easily overcome any obstacle that they encounter. But it's like, no, you could have things on this side of that. You can have things way on the other side, like Annihilation, where it doesn't even look human and it just like, destroys everything on sight or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. It didn't bother me too much.
I understand it to the point where if you have this big revelation where everything is connected at the end and then have one of those elements be really contrived or
a little bit Deus Ex Machina, maybe.
Yeah. Then I guess it makes sense. But given how the story is framed from this limited perspective, and it's clear from the very beginning that it's not about getting to know the ins and outs of the alien invasion. It's about the emotional impact of this on this one family. That to me is what the end is about. Like that's why you have the big music there. It's not because of the alien that's being like clubbed to death by Meryl, but because of like what that whole scene signifies for Graham and the rest of his family in more emotional terms, in more thematic terms. And I think in that sense it was very successful and worth studying for, as we talked about, a variety of reasons.
Yep. Maybe we could do a little bit of a section if we want to talk about this movie in relationship to Nope.
Yeah, I think Jordan Peele is definitely on a same trajectory as early M. Night Shyamalan, with these very well-constructed movies that have very clever and thoughtful things going on. Like there's a lot of information that's being carefully placed, and then there's clever revelations and details to pick up on. And I think with Nope, as I said, the thematic focus is different. I think it's more meta. It's more about movies themselves. It's more about spectacle. Whereas I think, as we've just talked about, that Signs is more of a discussion on faith and meaning. I'd love to hear your thoughts, obviously.
It's an interesting parallel because there's a lot of, the similarities beyond just the UFO aspect. I think how they both kind of use a narrowed perspective and media is very interesting. Like we also in Nope don't really go outside of the perspective of the characters except into like the Gordy scenes. I like how in Signs it engages with like TV and radio as a source of like information, and when you see the thing, it's just an interesting comparison to me to note that in Signs you have this kind of contrived scenario of, oh, they film him at a birthday party, because that's a scenario in which people would have out a video recorder because they'd be filming the birthday party and then they'd manage to catch this alien on. Whereas now it's just like, well, you have a camera everywhere, so you don't need an excuse for like, oh, why were they filming? They're both kind of touch on media as an element of their story. But I think it definitely, I found it interesting how much watching this brought to mind how little Nope touches on belief and how that doesn't play much of a role in the story itself. Like nobody in Nope is like, is the alien real or not? They're just like, oh yeah, it's there. They're not imagining it's a hoax. They're like, it's real and we just need to capture it on camera to prove it. I mean, they're slightly skeptical at the beginning, but not in this same way of like grappling with the reality of it. So I found that to be an interesting contrast.
Yeah. You also see it in they both deal with the impact of a bad miracle, as we've talked about. But I think in Nope, it's a bit less. It also becomes less about belief. Like, your dad gets killed by a coin that falls from the sky. Like it's either like totally random or like maybe some sort of sign. But it's not really a question, if I remember correctly, that's raised in Nope. Not necessarily that the movie is lesser because of it, but it's interesting how you can have the same sort of inciting events and then use them for different thematic questions.
There's no like good miracle counterpoint within Nope. It kind of starts out with that and then doesn't explore that idea further. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't have any specifically profound comparison, but I think there is definitely some interesting, not just overlap in terms of subject matter, but also in terms of themes, and the way in which they explore them is interesting to me. So
I think maybe also that the thing about Nope is that it questions everything in the context of nature and not in the context of God or like the idea of some sort of ultimate meaning. It kind of already assumes that nature is the force that decides our lives or that drives our lives, and that includes like randomness, but also the uncertainty and the unpredictability of, like as we talked about, and like animals are a big metaphor, and the UFO there is revealed to be a big organism instead of an intelligent force from, or like a ship or something like that. So yeah, that might be why the thematic focus might also be different, because the assumptions are already they kind of start out from a different point of view. But yeah. Well, thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show, be sure to check us out on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula, where you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get access to monthly bonus episodes that aren't available anywhere else. On Nebula, we for example covered the latest Doctor Strange movie, Sam Mendes' 1917, Stanley Kubrick's science fiction classic 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive. Right now, the best way to get access to Nebula is by signing up for CuriosityStream, which comes with a free Nebula subscription. To learn more, visit curiositystream.com/cinemaofmeaning or just follow the link in the show notes. And we'll see you again next time.